The sun has not yet touched the limestone pillars. Within the temple's deepest sanctuary, a perfect and heavy silence hangs in the air. This quiet was not empty, but charged with expectation. It was in these moments before dawn that the ancient Egyptian priests began their sacred work. Their world was one of hidden rituals and profound secrets, a series of 25 sacred practices designed to do one impossible thing: maintain the balance of the universe itself. These were not simple prayers, they were precise, daily operations that connected the gods to the pharaoh and fed the very order of creation. By the end of this journey, you will understand how these spiritual engineers held an entire civilization together through routines of water, starlight, and whispered magic. What was the terrifying consequence if a single ritual step was performed incorrectly, and how did a priest physically prepare to stand before a god? The answers lie in the meticulous, often strange world we are about to enter. What does it take to build a bridge between heaven and earth? The first and most fundamental rule was absolute cleanliness. A priest could not carry the dust of the ordinary world into the presence of a god. His preparation began not with prayer, but with a razor. Every single day, he would shave his entire body, head to toe, including every hair on his head and even his eyebrows. This was intensely practical, a defense against lice in the hot climate, but the meaning went far deeper. Hair was considered unclean, a potential hiding place for chaotic forces. By removing it all, the priest was symbolically shedding his human imperfections, becoming a blank, pure slate. Imagine the feel of cold bronze against skin, the quiet ritual of self-erasure performed in the dim light before dawn. This was the first act of leaving the mortal self behind, but the cleansing did not stop there. Before even approaching the innermost sanctuary, the priest had to undergo a ceremonial washing. He would descend the steps of a sacred lake, a rectangular pool of clear water nestled within the temple walls, or use water mixed with natron salt. This was not a casual rinse. It was a deliberate, symbolic drowning of his past day, a purification meant to wash away not just dirt, but any lingering thought, any shadow of doubt or worldly concern. The water was seen as a liquid barrier between the profane and the sacred. Stepping out, dripping and chilled, he was considered reborn, momentarily free from the contamination of mere existence. His body was now a suitable vessel, his mind a clear channel. Only in this state of radical purity could he hope to perform his duty, to open the door to the divine and not be consumed by its brilliance. This daily transformation from man into instrument was the essential, non-negotiable first step in every ritual that followed. If he skipped it, everything that came after was believed to be not just ineffective but dangerously offensive. The gods demanded perfection, and it started with skin and water. But purity of body was only the beginning. The priest's true work was to bridge a gap far wider than any human could cross. This brings us to one of the most profound and mysterious of the sacred practices, the opening of the mouth. This was not a ceremony for the living, but for the seemingly inanimate. It was performed on the grand stone statues of the gods that stood in the temple's inner darkness, on the linen-wrapped bodies of the deceased, and even on the very walls of a newly completed temple. Its purpose was nothing less than to awaken life. Think of a statue, cold and silent in the shrine. To the ancient Egyptian mind, it was not yet a home for a god. It was a potential, a vessel waiting to be activated. The priest, using a set of unique and ancient tools, would perform a precise series of gestures. He would touch the statue's mouth with a curved blade known as the pesishkef, a knife originally linked to childbirth, symbolizing a new beginning. He would then use a carpenter's adze, a tool for shaping wood, to symbolically open the eyes and ears. Each touch was accompanied by specific incantations, words of power that charged the action. This was not a physical carving, but a ritual animation. The priest was restoring the senses one by one: sight, hearing, smell, and finally speech. He was, in essence, building a functional interface between the divine and the mortal world. Once the mouth was opened, the statue could breathe the scent of incense, consume the essence of food offerings, and hear the prayers of the people. It could speak through oracles. The god now had a place to dwell. When performed on a royal mummy, the stakes were cosmic. The high priest himself would enact this ritual, ensuring the deceased pharaoh could see, breathe, and eat in the afterlife, transforming him into an effective eternal being, an act. Without this ceremony, even a perfectly preserved body was just an empty shell, and a magnificent statue was merely stone. The opening of the mouth was the ultimate act of priestly power, using ritual tools to turn potential into presence and silence into a channel for the divine voice. This silent pre-dawn procession was the heart of the entire system. The high priest, now purified and reborn, would lead a small group through the temple's increasingly restricted halls. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, as they moved further from the world of the living. Their destination was the naos, the innermost stone shrine where the god's cult statue resided. A single clay seal, stamped with the royal cartouch, blocked the shrine's doors. This seal was a sacred lock. Breaking it was the first official act of the day, a physical declaration that the ritual cycle was beginning anew. With careful hands, the priest would shatter the clay. The sound in that silent hall must have been deafening, a crack that signaled the reopening of a channel closed since sunset the day before. He would then enter the absolute darkness alone. No ordinary person, not even a lower-ranking priest, was permitted to follow. What happened inside was the empire's greatest secret. By the light of a single oil lamp, the priest would approach the statue. It was not the grand public monument we imagine, but likely a small, portable figure of wood overlaid with gold and inlaid with precious stones. To the priest, this was not an object, it was a sleeping entity. His first duty was to awaken it. He would cense the shrine with fragrant resins, the smoke representing the primordial mist from which creation emerged. He would then purify the statue itself, anointing it with water and natron, just as he had purified his own body hours before. This was a mirror act, a cleaning of the divine vessel. Next came the dressing. The priest would remove the previous day's linens and jewels with reverence. He would then adorn the statue in fresh, ritually clean linen and place upon it its ceremonial regalia, collars of faience, pectorals of gold, and lapis lazuli. Each piece had a name and a purpose, each knot tied with a specific incantation. This was not decoration, it was the activation of the god's royal and protective powers. Finally, he would present the morning meal. Plates of the finest bread, cuts of meat, bowls of beer and wine, and bundles of fresh lettuce were laid before the statue. The priest did not expect the physical food to vanish. Instead, he performed a crucial act of sympathetic magic. He would raise a small figure of the goddess Maat, the embodiment of cosmic truth and order, toward the statue's mouth. This gesture transferred the ka, the life force essence of the offering, directly to the god. The deity consumed not the substance, but the spiritual sustenance within it. The entire ritual was a delicate operation of cosmic maintenance. By feeding the god, the priest sustained its presence in the world. A satisfied god would then act to uphold Maat, the perfect balance of the universe. This meant the Nile would flood on time, the sun would rise, enemies would be defeated, and life would continue. The priest's daily chore in a dark room was, in their belief, the single most important job in Egypt. If he failed, if the ritual was incorrect or neglected, the god might withdraw its presence. The statue would become just wood and metal again, and the world would tilt back toward Isfet, the chaos that existed before creation. The fate of everything rested on this silent, secret series of actions performed before the dawn. The silence of the sanctuary was always broken by a single sound, the human voice. But this was not ordinary speech. The words spoken by the priest were considered tools as real and as powerful as the adze used in the opening of the mouth. This brings us to the fourth sacred practice, the mastery of the spoken and written word, a practice that combined sacred recitation with the raw creative force known as Heka. The priest was not just a reader, he was an operator of divine software, and the code was language itself. His library was not of scrolls for study, but of manuals for cosmic intervention. He drew from an ancient and evolving corpus of spells, starting with the pyramid texts carved inside royal tombs in the Old Kingdom, evolving into the coffin texts for the nobility, and later, for a wider audience, the spells we know as the Book of the Dead. These were not stories or prayers in our sense. They were precise technical instructions, a mix of mythological references, commands, and secret names, all designed to produce a specific effect in the spiritual realm. The priest's first duty was to memorize them perfectly. Imagine the weight of this task: a single mispronounced syllable, a stutter, or a word spoken out of sequence was not a minor error. It was a catastrophic system failure. In their belief, a garbled spell did not just fizzle out, it could backfire spectacularly. A protection chant could become an invitation for hostile spirits. A healing ritual might inadvertently afflict the patient with a greater illness. The power was in the exact sound vibration, the correct rhythm and pitch, which acted as a key to unlock a specific divine energy. This is where the concept of Heka comes into full view. Heka was not stage magic or superstition. It was understood as the fundamental creative force that the god Atum used to speak the universe into existence at the moment of creation. The divine word was the original building block of reality. By mastering Heka, the priest was tapping into that same primordial power. He was, in a very real sense, doing a small-scale version of what the gods did, using language to shape reality. When he recited a spell to protect the temple from a demon, he was not asking a god for help, he was commanding the demon directly through the authority of Heka. When he uttered healing incantations over the sick, he was restructuring the patient's spiritual body with the power of sound. The visual evidence of this is everywhere in the archaeological record. Hieroglyphic inscriptions on temple walls are not merely decorative, they are permanent spells. Their power activated every time a priest or even the sun god Ra passed by them. Papyri show spells surrounded by vivid illustrations, maps of the underworld, and depictions of monstrous entities to be vanquished, all serving as guides for the priest's journey and targets for his verbal commands. The act of writing the spell itself was an act of Heka, freezing the potent words in time. So the priest, standing before the god's statue, was doing far more than reciting poetry. He was a technician wielding the original tool of creation, using perfectly calibrated sound to maintain walls against chaos, to heal bodies, and to ensure the sun's journey across the sky. His voice was his most sacred instrument, and a single mistake could, in their view, unravel the very order he was sworn to protect. The power of Heka did not reside in words alone. To direct this raw creative force, the priest needed physical anchors, ritual tools that focused intention into tangible action. Among the most fascinating were the wands carved from hippopotamus ivory. These were not sleek pointers, but curved, protective objects often inscribed with fearsome deities and magical creatures. A priest might trace a sacred circle on the ground with such a wand, creating an impenetrable barrier against chaotic spirits. He would also employ amulets, tiny power packs carved from stone or molded from faience. Placed on a patient's body or buried at a temple's corner, an amulet of the Wedjat eye was not just a symbol of protection, it was believed to be a functional unit of healing energy, actively guarding its wearer. But the tools could also be used for a far darker purpose, one sanctioned by the state itself: execration rituals. In a secret ceremony, a priest would inscribe the names of foreign enemies, rebellious nobles, or even abstract concepts like famine and plague onto clay figurines or pottery bowls. He would then recite spells of binding and destruction before violently smashing the objects, trampling them, burning them, and burying the fragments in a cursed place. This was sympathetic magic of the highest order. The breaking of the vessel was the breaking of the enemy's power, a spiritual preemptive strike launched from the temple's inner rooms to protect the borders of Egypt. The most dramatic state ritual of protection was the breaking of the red pots. Performed during important festivals, it involved a procession where priests carried pots filled with a red liquid, symbolizing the blood of the chaotic god Seth, the enemy of order. At a designated moment, they would shatter the pots against a special monument or the ground. The crashing pottery and splashing red symbolized the perpetual defeat of chaos, a public reenactment of the pharaoh's divine duty to crush disorder. It was a loud, visceral reminder that the priest's quiet mourning rituals were directly linked to the safety of the nation. Perhaps the most publicly visible form of priestly Heka was the oracle. During great festivals, the statue of the god, housed in a portable shrine, would be carried on the shoulders of priests through the temple courts or even into the city streets. The air would thicken with incense and the roar of the crowd. People would shout questions to the passing god. Would the harvest be good? Should the king go to war? The answer came not in a voice but in movement. The priests bearing the heavy shrine would interpret its dips and sways as divine communication. A lurch forward might mean yes, a hesitation might mean no. To the faithful, this was the god moving among them. To a modern eye, it reveals the delicate, unspoken contract between the priests and the people. The priests, through years of training and physical coordination, could guide the shrine's movements, steering the answers toward outcomes that maintained stability and reinforced royal authority. This was not necessarily seen as fraud, but as a necessary stewardship of divine will, ensuring the god's messages supported maat and did not incite panic. Here we see the thin, almost invisible line between priestly duty and what we would call magic. From the private smash of an execration figurine to the public sway of a god's shrine, the priest was a master of applied spirituality. He used tools, words, and staged drama to shape reality, fight invisible wars, and comfort the populace, all under the sacred mandate to hold back the endless night of chaos. The swaying shrine and the shattered pots were public theater, but the most intimate form of divine communication happened in absolute stillness and darkness. Within the temple precincts, often attached to the outer walls, were special sanctuaries known as dream chambers. Here, a seeker would come not to speak, but to listen in their sleep. This was the practice of dream incubation, a sacred technology for receiving direct messages from the gods. A pilgrim, perhaps a merchant anxious about a journey or a woman hoping for a child, would undergo purification rites. They would then lie down on a simple pallet in the sacred space, surrounded by the lingering scent of incense and the palpable silence of the temple night. Their goal was not ordinary sleep, but a visionary state, a bridge into the divine mind. The most famous practitioner of this was the pharaoh himself. Before a major military campaign or at a moment of dynastic uncertainty, the king would enter a dream chamber, seeking a clear sign from Amun-Ra or another state god. His dream was not a private concern, it was a matter of national security, a divine directive for the entire kingdom. When the seeker awoke, clutching the fragments of a vivid, often puzzling dream, they did not interpret it themselves. That was the exclusive role of the priest. The dreamer would recount every detail, the strange animals, the shifting landscapes, the words spoken by luminous figures. The priest, consulting ancient dream manuals and drawing on his deep knowledge of symbolic language, would decode the vision. A dream of a flooding Nile might predict abundance, while a dream of a falling star could portend a death. The priest's interpretation held immense power. He could validate a pharaoh's decision to go to war, prescribe a life-changing course of action for a noble, or offer a desperate commoner a thread of hope. This positioned the priesthood not just as ritual technicians, but as the essential translators of the divine will, the only ones who could read the god's handwriting in the cryptic script of the sleeping mind. The practice reached its zenith in the healing cults of the later periods, most famously around the god Serapis. At his great temple in Alexandria, known as the Serapeum, the practice of dream incubation became a sophisticated medical protocol. The sick and the infirm would travel great distances to sleep in the temple's abaton, a restricted dormitory. The belief was that the god Serapis or his divine attendants would visit them in the night. The encounter itself was often considered part of the cure, a spiritual healing, but more commonly, the god would prescribe a treatment within the dream. A patient might dream of Serapis touching a specific part of their body, or of a priest figure handing them a particular herb. Upon waking, they would report this to the temple priests, who would then prepare the exact remedy, a poultice, a potion, or a regimen of bath. The psychological power of this system was profound. It placed the source of healing beyond human fallibility directly in the hands of the divine, yet it also made the priesthood utterly indispensable. They controlled the sacred space, they guided the preparation, and they alone held the authority to confirm the dream's meaning and enact its instructions. A cure delivered this way carried the ultimate authority, blending faith, suggestion, and often genuine therapeutic knowledge into an unassailable prescription. Through the gate of dreams, the priests solidified their role as the critical link, the only ones who could guide a troubled soul or a sick body from the confusion of the human world into the clear, commanding light of the divine. The dream was a private message, but some divine communications were witnessed by the entire nation. This brings us to a practice that blurred the line between the animal and the absolute divine, the management of sacred animal cults. In the bustling temple precincts of Saqqara or the grand complex at Bubastis, priests cared for living, breathing vessels of the gods. The most famous was the Apis bull, worshipped in Memphis as the earthly herald of the creator god Ptah. This was no ordinary bull. He was chosen through a strict set of divine markers, a black coat with a white diamond on his forehead, a scarab-shaped mark under his tongue, and double hairs on his tail. Once identified, the young bull was brought to a lavish temple enclosure, the Apium, where a team of priests became his full-time custodians. His life was one of unparalleled luxury. He was fed the finest grains and choice cuts of meat, adorned with gold and precious linens, and had his own harem of cows. The public could visit him on certain days, seeking his presence as a blessing. But the priest's duty went far beyond caretaking. They were interpreters. Every movement, every sound the bull made was scrutinized as a direct oracle. If the bull chose to stand in a certain corner of his pen, it could be interpreted as divine favor for a proposed royal edict. If he refused food or seemed agitated, it might signal the god's displeasure with a military campaign or a pending treaty. The bull's behavior was a living, breathing barometer of cosmic approval, and the priests were the only ones trained to read it. This made them incredibly powerful political advisors, as their interpretation of a bull's mood could sway the pharaoh's most critical decisions. The sacred animal's death was a national crisis, a moment when the god's presence left the earth. The entire country would enter a period of deep mourning. Then the priests would embark on a mammoth 70-day funerary ritual, mummifying the massive body with the same care given to a pharaoh, before entombing it in a gigantic stone sarcophagus in the Serapeum's underground catacombs. The search for the next Apis bull would begin immediately, a frantic quest to restore the vital link between heaven and earth. This cycle was repeated for other sacred animals, like the cats embodying the goddess Bastet, revered for their protective grace, or the ibises and baboons sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. These creatures lived in temple grounds, and their births, behaviors, and deaths were all part of a sacred dialogue managed by the priests. In a world where the divine could inhabit a living creature, the priest's role as zookeeper, interpreter, and mortician was one of their most visible and politically charged responsibilities, turning a barnyard into the most important oracle chamber in the land. The sacred animal's life was a divine message, but its death was an economic engine. The mummification of these creatures grew into an industry of staggering scale, a spiritual assembly line managed entirely by the priesthood. Pilgrims from across Egypt seeking favor from a particular god would travel to the relevant temple complex. There, for a fee paid directly to the temple priests, they could purchase a pre-mummified votive offering. The demand was immense. At the peak of this practice, millions of animals were mummified. The catacombs at Saqqara alone are estimated to hold over 4 million ibis mummies offered to Thoth. Nearby, galleries contain countless mummified cats for the goddess Bastet, falcons for Horus, and even dogs and jackals for Anubis. Walking through these underground labyrinths today, you would see neat stacks of linen-wrapped bundles, row upon row, vanishing into the darkness, a physical mountain of human devotion. For the temples, this was a major, reliable source of revenue. The priests oversaw every step, from breeding farms and aviaries that supplied the animals to the embalming workshops to the final sale and interment. It was a closed, sacred economy where faith was the currency. Recent technology, however, has cast a fascinating new light on this ancient practice. Scientists using non-invasive CT scans have peered inside these linen bundles, expecting to find complete skeletons. What they discovered was sometimes surprising. While many contain whole, carefully prepared animals, a significant number hold only partial remains. A bundle sold as a cat might contain just a few cat bones, or even the bones of a different animal entirely, packed with linen and mud to give it the right shape. Others are filled with nest-like arrangements of reeds and feathers. This does not necessarily point to widespread fraud, but rather to a complex priestly logic. With demand so incredibly high, the physical supply of perfect specimens may have simply run short. The priests likely believed the symbolic act and the ritual consecration were what truly mattered, that the essence of the offering was in the intention and the sacred packaging, not the biological completeness. Yet it hints at the immense pressure on the priesthood to meet an unending spiritual demand, a pressure that sometimes led to practical, if startling, shortcuts. These catacombs, then, are not just tombs, they are ledgers of ancient hope, revealing a system where the bridge to the gods was built, bundle by bundle, in a thriving holy marketplace. The linen-wrapped offerings in the catacombs represented hope preserved, but the daily sustenance of the gods flowed in liquid form. Deep within the temple workshops, far from the silent sanctuaries, priests oversaw a different kind of sacred craft, the brewing of beer and the pressing of wine. These were not hobbies but vital industries. The temple precincts often contained their own vast breweries and vineyards, producing on an industrial scale to meet a divine demand. Beer, thick and nutritious, was considered the drink of the common people and the gods alike, a gift from Osiris himself. Wine, a more luxurious import initially, became associated with the ecstatic worship of deities like Hathor. To the priestly mind, these beverages were not mere symbols. They were actual, essential nourishment for the divine Ka, the life force of the god residing in the statue. Just as a human needed food and drink to live, a god required this spiritual sustenance to maintain its presence and power in the world. Every morning, during the core ritual of awakening and dressing the god, the priest would present libations. He would raise vessels of beer and wine, pouring them from special ceremonial jars onto a slab before the statue or into bowls set at its feet. This act of pouring was a sacred transfer. The priest wasn't just leaving a drink, he was releasing the essence, the aroma and vitality of the liquid for the god to consume. The physical substance remained, of course, but its spiritual energy was absorbed. This left behind what were called the god's leftovers, but these were far from scraps. This consecrated food and drink, having been touched by the divine, now carried a powerful residual blessing. It became the foundation of the temple's entire economic and social structure. The beer and wine, along with bread and meat from the offerings, were systematically redistributed. A portion went to feed the vast ranks of temple staff, from scribes and artisans to cleaners and guards, as their regular wages. Another portion was distributed to the local community, especially to the poor and the elderly, as an act of charity that reinforced the temple's role as a pillar of society. In this way, a single ritual libation fed both the god and the entire human ecosystem that supported the god's home, turning a spiritual act into the engine of a local economy. There is also intriguing evidence that some sacred brews served a more mystical purpose. Recipes suggest the occasional inclusion of ingredients like blue lotus or mandrake, plants known for their mild psychoactive properties. It is likely that during great public festivals, particularly those dedicated to goddesses of joy and intoxication like Hathor or Bastet, specially prepared beer or wine was consumed by priests and perhaps even the public. This ritualized consumption would have been a gateway to an altered state, a deliberate blurring of the boundaries between the celebrant and the divine. In the euphoria of the dance and the drumming, fueled by a sacred drink, a worshipper might feel the presence of the goddess surging within them, experiencing a direct, ecstatic connection that the quiet morning rituals could not provide. So the priest's role extended from quality control in the brewery to managing the logistics of divine leftovers, and possibly even to facilitating moments of collective transcendence, where the community could literally taste a hint of the otherworldly grace their daily rituals worked so hard to maintain. The sacred brew was a measure of earthly time, but the priests kept their eyes on a far grander clock. High on the temple roofs, in the cool, silent hours of the night, another essential duty unfolded. The priests were not just spiritual caretakers, they were the empire's master timekeepers, and their clock was the vault of heaven itself. This was the ritual of the hours, a nightly vigil that synchronized human ritual with the flawless motion of the cosmos. The Egyptian night was divided into 12 hours, just like the day, but these hours were not fixed. Their length shifted with the seasons, growing longer in winter and shorter in summer. To know the exact moment to begin the pre-dawn ceremony of awakening the god, a priest had to observe the stars. He would climb to a cleared, flat area on the temple roof, carrying two simple but profound tools. The first was a merkit, a narrow, notched palm rib that functioned as a sighting instrument. The second was a bay, a plumb line, a weight suspended from a string to establish a true vertical. Working with a partner, one priest would hold the merkit to his eye, aligning its notch with a specific pre-chosen decan star, one of 36 stars or constellations that rose just before dawn at different times of the year. His partner would hold the bay, its steady vertical line serving as a reference. Together, they would wait in the darkness, tracking the star's slow transit across the invisible meridians of the sky. When the star crossed the plumb line, a specific hour of the night had arrived. By observing a sequence of these star transits, they could measure the passage of all 12 nighttime hours with remarkable accuracy. This was not astronomy for its own sake, it was a sacred, operational necessity. The ritual calendar was packed with festivals tied to lunar phases, solar events like the solstices, and the all-important heliacal rising of Sirius, which heralded the Nile's life-giving flood. If a major festival began at the wrong hour, it was like throwing a wrench into the gears of creation. The concept at the heart of this practice was maat, cosmic order. The sun god Ra sailed his bark through the 12 hours of night in the underworld, battling chaos to be reborn at dawn. By keeping perfect time on Earth, the priests were mirroring and supporting Ra's celestial journey. Their star observations were a form of active participation. They were ensuring the rituals that nourished the gods and the pharaoh happened in precise harmony with the universe's own rhythm. A mistake in timing was not a simple scheduling error. It was a tear in the fabric of maat, a moment where chaos could seep back into the world. So the priest on the roof, shivering slightly in the night air, squinting along his wooden merkit at a pinpoint of distant light, was doing something of monumental importance. He was using the oldest, most reliable mechanism in existence to set the alarm clock for the gods, making certain that when the first ritual libation was poured, it happened at the exact second the cosmos demanded. This celestial timekeeping gave the priesthood a power that was both practical and deeply mystical. The very stones of their temples were engineered to capture these cosmic moments. At Karnak, the great temple of Amun-Ra, the axis was aligned so that on the winter solstice, the rising sun would flood directly down the long central corridor, illuminating the inner sanctuary where the god statue dwelled. For a few brilliant moments, the architecture became a telescope focused on the rebirth of the sun, and the priests standing in that corridor would be bathed in a light that was, to them, the literal substance of the god. This was no accident of construction. It was a deliberate, monumental alignment, a stone calendar built to mark the sun's lowest point and its promised return, reinforcing the pharaoh's role as the son of Ra who guaranteed the cycle of the seasons. But the most anxiously awaited alignment involved not the sun, but a star. Each year, just before dawn in mid-July, Egyptian priests would scan the eastern horizon for the first, fleeting reappearance of Sirius, the dog star. After a 70-day period of invisibility, its heliacal rising, when it became briefly visible just before the sun washed it out, was the herald of the Nile flood. This single astronomical event dictated the entire rhythm of Egyptian life. When the priests spotted that pale glimmer, they would send messengers racing down the Nile to announce the imminent inundation, the lifeblood of their civilization. The timing of crucial agricultural rituals, tax collections, and the entire liturgical calendar hinged on this observation. To predict it was to hold the future of the nation in your gaze. This knowledge was a closely guarded secret of the priesthood. By monopolizing the observation and interpretation of the stars, they positioned themselves as the essential mediators between the predictable cosmos and the uncertain human world. Their control over the calendar was control over power itself. This celestial authority reached its peak in the most spectacular of royal rituals, the Sed festival. This was a jubilee ceremony meant to magically renew the pharaoh's strength and right to rule, typically after 30 years on the throne. Its timing was itself a sacred mystery, often tied to a significant cycle of the star Sirius or the completion of a Jovian cycle of the planet Jupiter. The festival was a marathon of symbolic events where the aged king would run a ritual course, fire arrows to the 4 cardinal directions, and be ceremonially crowned again, proving his enduring vitality. The priesthood orchestrated every moment of this cosmic theater. They chose the astronomically potent date, designed the ritual stages representing the unity of Egypt, and performed the incantations that transferred divine energy back into the monarch. For the people watching, it was a breathtaking spectacle of renewal. For the priests, it was a demonstration of their ultimate capability. They could use the clockwork of the heavens to reset the spiritual and political power of the state, to literally rejuvenate the living God on earth. This was the pinnacle of their role, not merely following celestial rhythms, but harnessing them to perform maintenance on the very soul of the kingdom. The stars set a time for renewal, but the priest's final service was for a journey with no return. Beyond the grand public festivals lay their most intimate duty, preparing a soul for the ultimate courtroom, the Hall of Maat. Here, in the silent space between death and eternity, the priest performed a sacred operation to defend the deceased against their own heart. This was the weighing of the heart ceremony, and while the final judgment belonged to Osiris and the 42 assessor gods, the priest's work on earth was the crucial legal defense. The heart to the Egyptians was not merely an organ. It was the seat of intellect, emotion, and memory, the record keeper of a person's entire life. In the Hall of Judgment, this heart would be placed on a giant golden scale, balanced against the single feather of Maat, representing truth and cosmic order. If the heart was heavy with guilt and wrongdoing, it would sink, and the monstrous devourer Ammit would consume the soul, ending it forever. But if the heart was as light as the feather, the soul would be declared true of voice and pass into the blessed afterlife. The terror was this: your own heart could testify against you. It held every secret, every unkind thought, every minor theft or lie. In that moment of divine truth, it might speak up. The priest's role was to ensure it remained silent. This began long before the body reached the embalming workshop. As part of the funerary rites, a priest would recite specific spells from the Book of the Dead directly over the mummy. These were not general blessings, they were targeted legal formulas designed to coach the heart. Spell 30b is explicit. It is a plea, an instruction, a command directed at the heart itself. The priest would speak the words meant to be the heart's own voice in the hall. Do not stand against me as a witness. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not tilt the scales against me. He was, in essence, prepping the most important witness for the trial, begging it to be an ally, not an accuser. But words alone were not enough. They needed a physical anchor, a piece of ritual technology placed directly on the body. This was the heart scarab, a large amulet often carved from dark green stone like serpentine or jasper, was placed over the mummy's chest, tucked within the linen bandages. On its flat underside was carved not a decorative pattern but the full text of spell 30b. The scarab beetle itself was the symbol of transformation and rebirth, chosen because it rolled the sun across the sky, just as the heart scarab would help roll the soul through judgment. The inscribed spell was a permanent, tangible prayer resting directly over the silent organ. It served as a constant reminder, a magical weight on the scales of the soul's own conscience, pleading for a favorable verdict. This practice reveals a profound and very human anxiety. Even the most virtuous person feared a moment of weakness, a forgotten misdeed, or a heart that might inexplicably betray them. The priest addressed this universal dread. By reciting the spells and placing the scarab, he was providing a service more valuable than gold. He was offering hope against the unknowable, a defense attorney for the soul preparing for a trial where the evidence was a lifetime of memories. He was the final architect of a person's eternal fate, using ritual and artifact to build a bridge over the abyss of non-existence, aiming for the field of reeds. The scarab amulet promised safe passage to eternity, but the power that secured a priest's authority was measured in bushels of grain. While their rituals maintained cosmic order, their day-to-day work involved managing something far more tangible, the immense economic engine of the temple itself. Beyond the sacred lakes and silent sanctuaries sprawled a different kind of complex, one of bustling workshops, overflowing granaries, and meticulously kept clay tablets. The great temples of Egypt were not just houses of worship, they were the largest corporations in the ancient world, and the high priest served as its chief executive officer. A temple like Karnak owned estates stretching for miles along the Nile, vast tracts of the most fertile land in the kingdom, granted by the pharaoh as a perpetual endowment to feed the god. This land did not sit idle. It was worked by thousands of farmers, tenants of the temple, who paid their rent not in coin but in a percentage of their harvest. That wheat and barley flowed into the temple's colossal granaries, mud brick silos that rose like mountains beside the sacred precincts. The scale is almost impossible to overstate. These granaries were the strategic grain reserves of the nation, a buffer against famine, and the primary currency for paying wages. Every scribe, artisan, guard, and cleaner on the temple payroll received their monthly compensation in measures of grain, oil, and beer, all drawn from this divine surplus. But the temple's wealth did not stop at agriculture. Within its walls were entire industrial zones. There were weaving workshops where women spun linen from temple-grown flax, creating the miles of cloth needed for priestly garments, divine vestments, and mummy wrappings. There were carpentry shops, jewelry ateliers where goldsmiths worked the precious metals given as offerings, and of course, the sprawling brewery and bakery complexes that produced the gods' daily meals. The high priest oversaw all of it. His staff included chief stewards, overseers of cattle, masters of the wardrobe, and controllers of the treasury. They kept meticulous records on papyrus and ostraca, pottery shards used as notepads. Every loaf of bread, every jar of ointment, every bolt of linen offered to the god was logged in detailed inventories. This was not mere bookkeeping, it was a sacred accounting. The offerings were the god's property, and managing them was a direct extension of the priestly duty to care for the deity's earthly household. This system transformed the temple into the economic and administrative heart of its region. It functioned as a bank, lending seed grain to farmers at the start of the planting season. It was a distribution center during hard times, providing charity from its stores. It was a major employer and the primary engine of local trade. The priest, therefore, wielded a dual authority. He was the spiritual intermediary who spoke to Amun-Ra at dawn, and by midday, he was the administrator deciding how many workmen were needed to repair a canal on the temple's north field. This concentration of wealth and logistical power created a political force that could, and sometimes did, challenge the throne itself. Nowhere was this more evident than in Thebes with the high priest of Amun. Over centuries, the endowment of gifts to the god Amun grew so vast that the temple of Karnak effectively controlled much of Upper Egypt. The high priest commanded his own militia, managed estates that rivaled the royal domains, and his influence over the oracle of Amun could make or break a pharaoh's legitimacy. During the politically fragmented Third Intermediate Period, the high priests of Amun in Thebes became the de facto rulers of the south, with some even adopting royal titles, their portraits carved in the traditional pharaonic pose. For a time, Egypt had two centers of power, the pharaoh's palace in the north and the high priest's administrative complex in the south, a clear testament to where true, durable power often resided, not just in the crown, but in the control of the land, the grain, and the god's boundless treasury. This immense wealth inevitably translated into direct political power. A pharaoh's legitimacy depended on the god's favor, and the priests held the keys to that approval. Their influence was most dramatically felt in the sacred theater of the oracle. When a new king was crowned, or a major decision like war or a treaty was pending, the pharaoh would formally petition the god for guidance. The statue carried by its priests would sway or dip in response. A positive movement was a public, divine endorsement, cementing the king's mandate to rule. But the reverse was also true. A hesitant or negative response from the oracle could cripple a pharaoh's authority, casting doubt on his very right to the throne. The priests, through their physical control of the shrine's movement and their exclusive role as interpreters, could effectively stage-manage these divine verdicts. This was not necessarily seen as deceit, but as a form of divine stewardship guiding the state toward stability. Yet it gave the high priesthood a veto power no vizier or general could match. They could anoint a king, or they could quietly undermine one. This delicate balance of power exploded into open conflict during one of the most revolutionary periods in Egyptian history, the reign of Akhenaten. He came to the throne as Amenhotep IV, a name honoring the state god Amun, whose priesthood in Thebes was at the peak of its wealth and influence. Early in his reign, perhaps chafing under their political and economic dominance, the young pharaoh made a radical break. He rejected the entire pantheon of gods, especially the powerful Amun, and declared there was only one true deity, the Aten, the sun disk. This was more than a theological shift. It was a direct, calculated attack on the priesthood's power base. Akhenaten stripped the temples of Amun of their revenues, diverted their grain to his new capital at Akhetaten, and chiseled the god's name from monuments across Egypt. He was attempting to dismantle the entire priestly economic and political machine in one bold stroke, centralizing all religious and state authority in himself as the sole intermediary of the Aten. For a brief time it worked. The old priesthood was sidelined, its influence shattered. But Akhenaten's revolution died with him. His successors, most notably Tutankhamun, were forced to reconcile with the entrenched power structure they had inherited. The edicts restoring the old gods and their priesthoods are a clear admission of political reality. The temples of Ammon were not just reopened, they were lavishly compensated, their lands and privileges restored and even expanded. The priesthood had weathered the storm, proving that their institution was more durable than any single pharaoh. Their power was rooted not in a king's whim, but in land, tradition, and the unshakable belief of the people. In the later periods, as foreign dynasties like the Libyans and Nubians ruled Egypt, the priesthood found new ways to wield influence. One of the most fascinating roles was that of the god's wife of Ammon. This was a royal title given to a daughter of the pharaoh, often from a foreign dynasty seeking legitimacy. She would be adopted by the serving god's wife and installed in Thebes. While she performed important rituals, her true power was economic and political. She controlled vast estates, commanded her own staff, and served as a direct, high-status link between the royal house in the north and the powerful Ammon priesthood in the south. For a Libyan or Nubian king, having his daughter as the god's wife was a masterstroke. It bought the loyalty of Thebes, the spiritual heart of Egypt, and gave his family a permanent, influential foothold within the country's most powerful institution. Through her, the priesthood could gently guide royal policy, and the king could ensure the god's blessings flowed his way. This symbiotic relationship reveals the ultimate truth. The sacred practices of purification, ritual, and oracle were never separate from the halls of power. They were the very foundation upon which political authority was built and maintained. To control the temple was to hold the deed to the kingdom's soul, and the priests were its eternal custodians. The immense wealth of the temples was a testament to a divine contract, a bond between the king and the gods that required constant renewal. One of the most potent rituals for this renewal was the sacred marriage, a ceremony where the boundaries between the pharaoh, the gods, and the fertility of the land itself were symbolically dissolved. This was not a literal wedding, but a profound piece of state theater designed to recharge the very source of royal power. During great festivals, particularly the Opet festival at Thebes, the pharaoh would take on the role of the god Ammon. A high priestess, often the god's wife of Ammon herself, would embody the goddess Maat, Ammon's consort. The ritual's climax often involved a spectacular procession. The statues of Ammon, Maat, and their son Khonsu would be placed upon magnificent ceremonial barges, gleaming with gold and precious inlays. These divine vessels were then carried from the Karnak temple on the shoulders of priests, through streets packed with roaring crowds down to the river. There they were transferred to enormous, real river barges, towed by smaller boats and accompanied by a flotilla of musicians and dancers for a journey to the Luxor temple. This voyage recreated the mythical journey of the sun god and symbolized the divine family's visit to their southern home. Within the privacy of the Luxor temple's inner chambers, the symbolic union of the god and goddess was enacted. The pharaoh and the priestess would perform a series of prescribed rituals, likely involving offerings, libations, and specific gestures of union witnessed only by the highest-ranking priests. The goal was explicit: to magically ensure the fertility of the land, the abundance of the Nile, and most crucially, the renewal of the king's own divine essence, his Ka. By ritually becoming Ammon, the pharaoh was not just representing the god, he was temporarily fused with him. This sacred act transferred the god's creative, life-giving power directly into the person of the king. It was a spiritual recharge for the monarchy, a ritual proof that the pharaoh was indeed the living son of the god, capable of mediating between heaven and earth. The priests were the essential stage managers and technicians of this cosmic drama. They prepared the sacred barges, choreographed the processions, purified the participants, and recited the incantations that transformed a political figure into a vessel of divine force. Every drumbeat, every chant, every step of the procession was calculated to manifest a single reality. The king and the god were one, and their union guaranteed the continued flourishing of Egypt. Without this priestly orchestration, the magic would fail, the connection would fray, and the kingdom would risk sliding back into the sterile chaos from which it was born. The sacred marriage renewed the king's power for the living, but the priest's final duty was to secure a soul's power for eternity. The elaborate process of mummification was only the beginning, a physical preservation that set the stage for the true spiritual work at the tomb itself. Here, the priest transformed from embalmer to psychopomp, a guide for the dead through the most perilous transition of all. The climactic ritual was a second, even more crucial, opening of the mouth. As the mummy stood upright before its sealed tomb, a priest, often the deceased's son or a designated Sem priest wearing a leopard skin, would perform the ceremony using the same sacred adzes and blades used on temple statues. He would touch the mummy's mouth, eyes, ears, and nose, restoring the senses to the linen-wrapped form. This was the moment of activation. Without it, all the careful preservation was for nothing. The deceased would be blind, mute, and trapped in their own body forever, unable to eat, drink, or see in the beautiful field of reeds. The ritual literally opened the door to the afterlife. Alongside this, another specialist priest took center stage, the lector priest. His role was not manual but entirely vocal. He held the sacred scroll, a customized copy of the Book of the Dead prepared for this specific individual. His voice, clear and unwavering, would fill the tomb chapel as he recited the spells that mapped the underworld's dangers. He provided the deceased with the words to pass by hostile gatekeepers, to know the names of the demons, and to navigate the labyrinth of the night. Spell 125, the famous negative confession where the soul declares its innocence before Osiris, was a legal defense memorized from this priest's recitation. The lector priest was equipping the dead with an essential survival manual, spoken into existence at the very threshold of the journey. But the tomb's perimeter also needed protection from forces that might follow the soul inside. As the final act before sealing, priests would perform the ceremony of the breaking of the red pots. They would take pots filled with a red liquid, symbolizing the blood of the chaotic god Seth, and hurl them against the tomb's outer wall or a special ritual mound. The shattering clay and splashing red were a violent, definitive act of symbolic magic. It created a spiritual barrier, repelling any chaotic entities that might seek to defile the burial or harass the vulnerable soul. With the senses restored, the guidebook recited, and the perimeter secured, the tomb was sealed. Yet the priest's service did not end there. For a soul to thrive eternally, it required constant nourishment. Its Khan needed regular offerings. This created one of the temple's most enduring revenue streams, the mortuary service contract. A family would pay the temple priesthood in grain, land, or precious goods to provide perpetual care. A priest, often from a special funerary division, would be assigned to visit the tombs, offering chapel daily or on festival days. He would present fresh bread, beer, and incense, reciting the formula. An offering which the king gives to Osiris, that he may give invocation offerings of bread and beer, beef and fowl to the Ka of the deceased. The family's payment ensured this ritual continued for generations, turning the priest into a permanent caretaker of memory and a conduit for spiritual sustenance. In this way, the bond between the living, the dead, and the priesthood became a perpetual cycle, a sacred economy where the price of eternal life was paid in bushels of wheat and the faithful voice of a priest echoing down the centuries. The leopard skin draped over his shoulders was a map of stars against the night, each spot representing a constellation in the sky. This was the uniform of the Sem priest, the master of ceremonies for the final, terrifying transition from life to death. While other priests handled the daily temple rituals, the Sem priest specialized in the sacred mechanics of the end. His role was intensely personal, often filled by the eldest son of the deceased, making him both a mourner and a magician. If no son was available or qualified, a professional from the temple's funerary service would step in, a hired expert in guiding souls. From the very first day in the embalming workshop, the Sem priest was present. He did not perform the physical cutting. That grim task fell to the paraskist, the cutter, who would make the incision and then flee from the ritual impurity, chased by stones. The Sem priest's work was different. He stood as the ritual overseer, reciting the spells that sanctified each step, transforming a gruesome medical procedure into a holy rebirth. He was the guardian of the process, ensuring that every organ removed was placed under the protection of a specific deity, every linen strip wrapped with the correct incantation. His knowledge had to be encyclopedic, a fusion of sacred text and practical anatomy. He needed to know which spell corresponded to the canopic jar holding the lungs, and he also needed to understand enough about decomposition to verify the embalmer's work was proceeding correctly. This was the ultimate blurring of lines, where priest became mortician, and a science of preservation became an act of spiritual engineering. The climax of his duty came at the tomb itself, before the sealed doorway. Here, the Sem priest performed his most dramatic act. A live calf was brought before the upright mummy. The priest would then symbolically butcher the animal, cutting its foreleg and touching the mummy's mouth with it. This was not mere slaughter. The calf represented the god Seth, the murderer of Osiris. By ritually dismembering it, the Sem priest was reenacting the defeat of chaos and death itself. He was transferring the life force, the ka, of the sacrificed animal directly to the deceased, a final, powerful jolt of vitality to propel the soul into the afterlife. Ancient tomb paintings capture this moment with stark clarity. We see the Sem priest, distinct in his leopard skin, holding the adze to the mummy's mouth while assistants restrain the struggling calf. Every gesture is frozen in time, a permanent instruction manual for resurrection. His expression in these images is never one of grief, but of intense, focused concentration. He is performing a technical operation. His tools are words and ritual gestures, and his patient's eternity hangs in the balance. To fail in his duty was to condemn a soul to oblivion, to leave a perfectly preserved body as a silent, senseless prison. The weight he carried was the weight of a universe balanced on the edge of a ceremonial blade. The Sem priest's final ritual secured a single soul's eternity, but once a year, the entire city of Thebes erupted in a celebration meant to renew the soul of the nation itself. This was the festival of Opet, a spectacle of music, color, and raw spiritual power that transformed the normally restricted world of the gods into a public jubilee. For nearly a month, the solemn silence of Karnak Temple was shattered by the roar of crowds and the rhythmic beat of drums. The sacred statues of the divine triad, Ammon, his consort Maat, and their son Khonsu, were carefully removed from their shrines. Priests, their bodies gleaming with oil and draped in pure white linen, would lift the heavy portable barks that housed the gods onto their shoulders. These were not simple palanquins, but miniature gilded ships, complete with cabins and prows shaped like ram's heads for Ammon, gleaming under the fierce Egyptian sun. The procession began on foot, a glittering river of gold and linen moving slowly through the monumental gateways of Karnak. Soldiers cleared the path, while acrobats tumbled and dancers whirled, their bodies painted and their movements ecstatic. The air grew thick with the smoke of frankincense and myrrh, burned in great censers swung by junior priests. This was the gods' journey from their home to their southern palace, the Luxor Temple, and the entire population was invited to witness it. The route was lined with people shouting praises, weeping with joy, and reaching out hoping to catch a glimpse of the divine faces normally hidden in perpetual darkness. For most Egyptians, this was the only time they would ever see the physical forms of their most powerful gods. The emotional release was immense, a collective catharsis that bonded the people to the state religion in a way daily rituals never could. After the procession wound through the city streets, it reached the banks of the Nile. Here, the true magnificence of the state's investment was revealed. The divine barks were transferred from the priest's shoulders onto enormous, real river barges. These vessels were floating temples, their cabins draped in fine linen and hung with garlands of flowers, their masts flying bright pennants. Towed by smaller boats rowed by the pharaoh's own troops, the god barges began a stately voyage south, accompanied by a flotilla of musicians and singers. The river itself became a sacred highway, its banks crowded with villagers who had traveled for days to watch the gods sail by. Upon reaching Luxor, the procession repeated in reverse, carrying the gods to their temporary residence. But the public spectacle was only the outer shell. Once inside the sealed chambers of Luxor Temple, away from all eyes, the secret heart of the festival took place. The pharaoh would enter the inner sanctuary alone with the high priests. There, in rituals so secret no record of their details survives, the king participated in ceremonies designed to accomplish one miraculous thing: to magically rejuvenate his divine ka, his life force. This was not a symbolic gesture. In the theology of the time, the pharaoh's ka was the energetic engine of his kingship, a spiritual battery that could deplete over time. Through unrecorded rites likely involving sacred communion, anointing, and perhaps a ritual recoronation, the priests facilitated a transfer of power from the god Ammon directly into the person of the king. The pharaoh emerged from Luxor Temple not just as a ruler, but as a god reborn, his authority freshly minted and his connection to the source of all power reaffirmed. The genius of the Apat festival was its layered purpose. For the masses, it was an intoxicating public holiday, a chance to see the gods, to feast on temple-distributed food and beer, and to participate in a collective euphoria that reinforced their place in a stable, joyful universe. It made the distant, mysterious power of the state tangible and glorious. For the elite and the priesthood, it was a powerful display of theological and political order, a reminder that the king's right to rule was renewed by divine hands within their very temples. And for the pharaoh himself, it was the essential spiritual maintenance that kept the machinery of kingship functioning. The entire extravagant production, funded by the temple's vast grain stores and orchestrated down to the last drumbeat by the priesthood, served a single cohesive goal: to weld the people, the gods, and the king into one harmonious whole. The priests were not just stage managers, they were the engineers of this national recharge, proving that their most vital work sometimes required not silence and secrecy, but the deafening, joyful roar of an entire city celebrating the visible bond between heaven and earth. The deafening joy of the festival gave way once more to the intimate silence of the sanctuary. In that sacred quiet, another sense took precedence: the sense of smell. For the ancient Egyptians, the bridge to the divine was not built by sight or sound alone, but by fragrance. The air within the temple was never empty. It was carefully sculpted with sacred smoke and perfumed oils, a practice so essential it was considered the very atmosphere of the gods. The most revered of these substances was a complex incense known as kai-fi. Its recipe was a temple secret passed down through generations of priests. Ancient texts give us glimpses into its magical composition. It was a blend of 16 ingredients, each meticulously gathered and prepared. Think of raisins and wine, honey from temple apiaries, fragrant resins like frankincense and myrrh, the roots of sweet flag, and the bark of cinnamon and cassia. Some recipes even included juniper berries and pine resin. These were not simply tossed together. The process was a ritual in itself, taking days. Ingredients were soaked, ground, mixed, and then shaped into pellets or cones while priests recited specific incantations over the mixture. This was cooking for the cosmos, each step charging the substance with Heka, with creative power. Kai-fi had a specific purpose. It was the incense of the evening. As the sun set and Ra began his perilous journey through the underworld, priests would burn kai-fi in the temple halls. Its smoke was thick, sweet, and slightly resinous, designed to do two things: to purify the sacred space of any lingering chaos from the day, and to please the gods, to make the temple a fragrant, welcoming home for their nightly return. The scent was believed to have healing properties, to calm the mind and invite prophetic dreams. But its primary function was olfactory diplomacy. It was an offering of pleasure to divine senses far beyond our own. This fragrant technology extended from the air to the skin. Before the daily ritual of dressing the god's statue, a priest would anoint it with sacred oils. One of the most prized was oil from the moringa tree, known for its light, stable texture and sweet, nutty aroma. Using his finger or a special golden spoon, the priest would touch the oil to the statue's limbs, its forehead, its chest. This was not mere polishing. It was an act of consecration and activation. The shimmering oil made the gold and precious stones gleam in the lamplight, yes, but it also symbolically sealed the god within its vessel, refreshing its divine presence. The same sacred oils were used on the pharaoh during coronations and festivals like Opet. When the high priest anointed the king's forehead, wrists, and chest with moringa oil, it was a tangible transfer of divine favor. The king was being marked as the god's chosen, his human form made fragrant and radiant with their essence. He literally carried the smell of holiness with him. This idea points to the core belief behind all this sensory ritual. The Egyptians did not think of smell as a passive experience. They believed fragrant smoke and perfume were tangible substances, as real as bread or water. The smell of incense was the literal breath of the gods. When a priest sensed the shrine, he was generating the atmosphere of the primordial mound, the scent of creation itself. The rising smoke was a visual and olfactory pathway, a ladder the deity could descend. For a worshipper, breathing in that sanctified air was a form of communion, taking the divine directly into their body. The visual record is filled with this practice. Temple reliefs show rows of offering bearers presenting cones of incense. Archaeologists have found beautiful incense burners made of faience or bronze, shaped like a sacred vase or an outstretched hand. In tomb paintings, the deceased is shown inhaling the scent of a giant lotus blossom, absorbing its life-giving fragrance for eternity. The priests, therefore, were master perfumers of the soul. They understood that to reach a realm beyond words, you sometimes needed to speak in a language of smoke and scent, crafting a bridge from the human nose to the divine nostril, one fragrant prayer at a time. The sacred scent of Kaifi was a product of global exchange. To produce the exact substances their rituals demanded, the priesthood had to become masters of a vast international supply chain, stretching far beyond the borders of Egypt. The resins that formed the heart of their incense, frankincense, and myrrh did not grow along the Nile. They were the hardened sap of scraggly trees that thrived in the arid, rocky landscapes of a distant land the Egyptians called Punt, likely modern-day Somalia, Yemen, and Eritrea. Acquiring these treasures was a monumental undertaking that blurred the lines between a spiritual quest and a state-sponsored trade mission. The temple, with its immense resources, often financed and organized these expeditions. A royal fleet would be commissioned, massive ships built from cedar wood imported from Lebanon, another sacred commodity. These vessels would sail down the Red Sea, a dangerous journey of months, navigating by the stars the priests themselves tracked. Upon reaching the coast of Punt, Egyptian envoys, likely accompanied by priestly scribes to ensure ritual purity of the goods, would negotiate with local chiefs. They traded Egyptian goods like beads, weapons, and finely crafted jewelry for heaps of fragrant resin tears, live incense trees to transplant, and exotic animals like baboons for the temple gardens. The return of a successful expedition was a national event. The pharaoh would present the bounty directly to the temple, and priests would carefully inventory each lump of resin, each sack of aromatic wood. This was not mere shopping, it was the harvesting of divine essence from the edges of the known world. The priesthood's need for a specific scent directly fueled exploration, diplomacy, and long-distance commerce, making them central players in the ancient global economy. Their rituals literally could not function without this network. Back within the temple walls, this imported bounty was met with homegrown expertise. Adjacent to the great stone pylons were often elaborate temple gardens, sacred green spaces managed under the direct supervision of the priests. These were not decorative parks but functional laboratories. Here they attempted to cultivate the precious frankincense and myrrh trees brought back as saplings from Punt, creating a living library of sacred botany. While these foreign trees often struggled in the Egyptian climate, the garden successfully grew a host of other ritual plants. There were beds of blue lotus whose narcotic blossoms were used in rituals and medicine. Mandrake, with its strange, human-shaped root, was cultivated for its purported magical properties. Papyrus and reeds for ritual mats and baskets grew in carefully tended pools. Every plant had a purpose, a specific spell or offering it was destined for. The priests overseeing these gardens needed a deep, practical understanding of horticulture, soil, irrigation, and harvesting cycles. They had to know when the lotus was most potent, how to extract oil from the moringa seeds, and which leaves produced the best dye for priestly sashes. This was applied sacred science. By controlling the cultivation, they ensured a pure, ritually correct supply of materials, free from the contamination that might affect goods bought in a public market. It also provided a living classroom for initiates who would learn to identify plants by their sacred names and understand their place in the cosmic order. The garden was a microcosm of a world sustained by maat, where every leaf and root played its part in maintaining the balance. The final transformation happened in the temple workshop, a place that smelled of sawdust, crushed herbs, and melting fat. Here, the imported resins and garden harvests were transformed into the finished sacred products. Priests with specialized knowledge, essentially the chemists of their day, oversaw these processes. Creating the sacred oils involved steeping fragrant woods and flowers in base oils, then pressing them through linen filters, a slow alchemy that captured the soul of the plant. The manufacture of kaifi was even more complex, requiring precise measurements, specific temperatures, and the correct order of mixing. A mistake in the recipe would not just produce a bad smell, it would render the substance ritually useless or worse, offensive to the gods. This demanded a rigorous, almost scientific methodology passed down through generations in secret temple manuals. The priesthood, therefore, embodied a unique fusion of roles. They were international traders securing raw materials from the ends of the earth. They were expert botanists cultivating and classifying sacred flora. They were master perfumers and chemists synthesizing precise compounds. All this worldly, practical knowledge served one transcendent goal: to produce the exact physical substances that would please a god's senses, purify a sacred space, or defend a soul in the underworld. Their spiritual authority was built, in part, on a foundation of remarkable logistical and technical skill, proving that the path to the divine could begin in a garden bed, a merchant's ledger, or a steaming workshop. The scent of sacred oils lingered not only for the living gods, but for the kings who had become them. Within towering structures known as mansions of millions of years, the great mortuary temples lining the Nile's west bank, priests performed a duty that stretched across centuries. Every single day, in chapels dedicated to pharaohs long turned to dust, they presented offerings of bread, beer, and incense to the stone statues of past kings. This was the ritual of the royal ancestors, a continuous act of remembrance that served as the spiritual backbone of the state. The belief was straightforward: a pharaoh did not cease to be divine upon his death. His spirit, now merged with Osiris, retained immense power to influence the world of the living. A contented royal ancestor would use that power to bless the reign of his successor, ensuring the Nile flooded and enemies remained at bay. A neglected ancestor, however, could become a restless, vengeful force, withdrawing his protection and allowing chaos to seep into the kingdom. The priesthood's task was to keep these powerful ghosts firmly on the throne side. The daily ritual mirrored the one performed for Amun-Ra at Karnak. A priest would enter the statue chamber, break the clay seal on the shrine, cense the statue, dress it in linen, and present a meal. He would recite the same offering formula, feeding the eternal Ka of the deceased king. This was not empty ceremony, it was active statecraft. By maintaining this perpetual service, the current pharaoh demonstrated filial piety on a cosmic scale. He proved he was the rightful heir, the one who honored the chain of divinity stretching back to the time of the gods. It visually and ritually linked him to an unbroken lineage of semi-divine rulers, wrapping his own authority in the sanctified mantle of all who came before. The priests in these temples, therefore, became the eternal caretakers of Egypt's history and its royal legacy. They were the keepers of the king list, the guardians of royal cults that could last for millennia. Their meticulous recitations of a pharaoh's names and titles were not just prayers, they were acts of preservation, preventing a king's memory from fading into the oblivion of the underworld. To have your name spoken was to exist, to have it forgotten was the second true death. In this sacred economy of memory, the priesthood held the ledger. Their daily offerings were the currency that purchased the ongoing support of the entire divine dynasty, making them indispensable brokers between the present throne and the collective power of the past. The scent of the ancestors was a memory in stone, but the stones themselves held a deeper secret. The great temples were not just houses for the gods, they were vast, three-dimensional maps of the universe, and the priests were the cartographers. Their sacred practice extended beyond ritual into the very geometry of the sacred space, embedding the story of creation into every column, every axis, and every step a worshipper took. To walk through a temple was to reenact the journey from the chaos of primordial waters into the stillness of the first moment of order. It began at the massive pylon gate, towering before the common citizen like a cliff of carved stone. This entrance was not just impressive, it was symbolic. The two tall towers represented the horizon, the place where the sun god Ra was reborn each day. Passing between them, you crossed the threshold from the profane world into a realm governed by divine law. The outer court beyond was open to the sky, bright with sunlight and often crowded with people during festivals. This space represented the emerged land, the first solid ground rising from the watery chaos of none. Here, the world was still noisy, active, and populated. But the journey inward was a journey backward in cosmic time. You would move from the bright court into a hypostyle hall, a forest of stone columns. The design here was meticulously intentional. The columns were not generic, they were shaped as giant stalks of papyrus or lotus plants, their capitals blooming into stone flowers high above. This transformed the hall into a symbolic marsh, a recreation of the lush, fertile thicket that covered the first mound of creation. The stone ceiling, painted deep blue and dotted with golden stars, represented the night sky. So standing in this hall, you were simultaneously in a marsh and under the cosmos, surrounded by the very plants of life, all held up by the enduring order of stone. The further you went, the darker, more restricted, and quieter the spaces became. The floor gradually rose and the ceiling slowly lowered. This was not an architectural accident. The rising floor symbolized the ascending primordial mound. The lowering ceiling increased the sense of intimacy and pressure, compressing the space toward a point of ultimate focus. Fewer and fewer people were permitted to proceed. The noise of the outer world faded away, replaced by an echoing silence broken only by the soft steps of the priests. Finally, you would reach the naos, the Holy of Holies. This was a small, windowless, and often completely dark chamber, housing the god statue in its shrine. Here, the floor was at its highest, the ceiling at its lowest. This was the point of creation itself, the still, dark, silent center before the dawn of time. In this perfect emptiness, the god resided. The entire architectural plan was a funnel, filtering out chaos step by step, light by light, sound by sound, until only pure potential remained. The priests did not just work in this environment, they designed it. Their secret knowledge included sacred geometry, aligning the temple's main axis with specific celestial phenomena. The temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak aligns so the winter solstice sunrise shines down its entire length to the inner shrine. The temple of Abu Simbel was positioned so the sun's rays would illuminate the statues of the gods deep inside on 2 specific days of the year. This required an incredible understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and surveying, all applied to a spiritual purpose. The temple was a machine built to harness cosmic power, a permanent ritual frozen in limestone and granite. For the priest, moving through these spaces daily was itself a sacred practice. He wasn't just walking to work, he was traversing the stages of creation, leaving the multiplicity of the world behind to enter the unity of the divine source. His architectural knowledge was a form of high wisdom, a blueprint for the universe that he helped maintain with every ritual performed in its carefully calculated heart. Before a single stone could be laid, the ground itself had to be sanctified. This was the stretching of the cord ceremony, a fusion of astronomy, royal power, and sacred geometry that would determine the temple's place in the cosmos. The pharaoh himself would preside, acting as the living representative of the god Seshat, the goddess of writing and measurement. Under a clear night sky, the king and the high priest would take hold of a length of rope knotted at intervals. They would sight along this cord, aligning it with the North Star or a significant constellation, often the imperishable stars that circled the celestial pole. This was not a rough estimate. By fixing the temple's axis to the eternal, unchanging stars, they were anchoring the future building to the very pillars of the universe. The orientation was everything. A temple aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, like Karnak, would capture the reborn sun's light. One aligned to the rising of Sirius would forever be tied to the Nile's flood. The stretched cord became the first sacred line, the backbone of the entire complex, ensuring the finished structure would be a true reflection of celestial order on Earth. Once the cord was pegged into the virgin soil, the outline of the temple was literally drawn in the sand, a divine blueprint made visible. With the sacred lines established, the next act was to seal a pact with the earth. At each of the temple's 4 corners, and sometimes at intervals along the walls, priests would dig deep pits. Into these they would carefully place what are known as foundation deposits. These were not random offerings, but a curated collection of ritual objects. Archaeologists have found them by the thousands, miniature treasure troves buried in the dust. Each deposit typically contained a set of ceramic molds in the shape of tools, tiny bricks, and food offerings. The molds represented the very instruments of creation, the chisels, saws, and adzes that would build the temple, now consecrated and given to the earth. Alongside them were often small plaques of precious metals, gold, silver, and electrum, inscribed with the name of the reigning pharaoh. They might include faience amulets of gods and goddesses, bundles of real food like grains and cuts of meat, and even the bones of sacrificial animals. The act of burying these items was a profound piece of sympathetic magic. It was a gift to the spirits of the land, a payment for the ground now taken. More importantly, it was a planting of sacred seeds. Just as a farmer plants grain to secure a future harvest, the priests planted these symbolic kernels of order, tools, and divinity to ensure the temple that grew from this spot would be holy, protected, and eternally aligned with maat. The foundation deposits were a spiritual root system, anchoring the massive stone walls to the primordial powers below. This entire process transformed construction from a labor project into a continuous act of worship. Every stone that was later quarried, floated down the Nile, and hauled into place was following a path laid down by stars and sealed by ritual. The workers, from the master architects to the laborers, were not just building a house for a god, they were assembling a piece of the cosmos itself. The temple's rising walls echoed the emerging primordial mound. Its columned halls mirrored the first papyrus marshes, and its inner darkness replicated the pre-dawn silence of creation. The ceremonies performed before the first block were set guaranteed that this resemblance was not merely symbolic but magically actual. The building was alive from the moment the cord was stretched, its destiny woven into the fabric of the ordered universe. To walk through the finished gates was to step into a reality that was conceived in the stars, born from ritual deposits, and maintained by the daily breath of incense and prayer, a perfect stone-born echo of the world as it was meant to be. But within that grand architectural funnel of sound and celebration, there existed a realm of absolute quiet. The most sacred moments demanded not the roar of the crowd, but a silence so complete it became a palpable force. This was the 17th practice, the deliberate cultivation of sacred silence, a discipline as rigorous as any memorized spell or star observation. In the innermost sanctuary, before the sealed doors of the god's shrine, the world of festival drums and chanting priests fell away. Here, in the windowless dark, the only sounds were the ones you brought with you, the soft, almost deafening rustle of your own linen robes, the careful scuff of a sandal on the polished stone floor, the faint, rhythmic whisper of your own breath. The high priest, approaching the god's statue with the morning meal, moved with a slow, deliberate precision that made no unnecessary noise. Even the ritual instruments were chosen for their subtlety, the gentle hiss of water from a libation vessel, the soft clink of a golden collar being placed, the delicate, shaking whisper of a sistrum, a sacred rattle whose sound was meant not to announce, but to ward off silence's only enemy, the creeping presence of chaotic forces. This quiet was not empty, it was thick with intention. It was a mark of ultimate respect. To babble or stumble in this space was to treat the divine like a market vendor, to impose the chaotic noise of the human world upon the perfect pre-creation stillness where the god resided. The silence was a form of listening. In the absence of human speech, the priest opened his awareness, hoping to perceive the subtle movements of the divine presence, a shift in the lamplight's shadow, a feeling in the air, the unspoken answer to an unvoiced prayer. It was in this resonant quiet that the words he did eventually speak, the ancient spells and invocations, gained their immense power. Freed from the clutter of everyday sound, each syllable hung in the air, distinct and heavy with meaning. A single sentence spoken here was believed to carry more creative force, more Heka, than an hour of public chanting outside. The silence acted as a focusing lens, concentrating the priest's entire will and the ritual's energy into a razor-sharp point aimed at the heart of the cosmos. The contrast with the world just beyond the sanctuary wall could not have been more stark. Outside, during the festival of Opet, the air vibrated with ecstatic noise, a joyful cacophony meant to attract the god's attention and involve the entire community. But that celebration was the journey, the procession. The silence within was the destination. The noisy festival brought the god's statue to the people, but the silent ritual brought the priest to the god. One was inclusive, horizontal, connecting the community. The other was exclusive, vertical, connecting a single, purified human consciousness directly to the source of all things. To master this practice was to master the self, to still the internal chatter of fear and doubt as completely as one stilled one's tongue. In that perfect, charged quiet, standing before the gleaming eyes of a god in the dark, the priest was not performing a ritual, he was becoming part of one, a living component in a silent machine of eternity, where the only acceptable sound was the universe itself listening. The profound silence of the sanctuary was a weapon against chaos, but sometimes the enemy required a more dramatic public defeat. This brings us to a practice where ritual became theater, and the pharaoh took center stage as the divine hero. It was the ritual hunting of the hippopotamus, a symbolic drama orchestrated entirely by the priesthood. In the marshes along the Nile, the real hippopotamus was a force of raw, destructive power. It could capsize a fishing boat, trample crops, and kill with a single bite. To the Egyptian mind, this beast became the perfect living symbol of Isfet, the blind, churning chaos that existed before creation and constantly threatened to return. The hippo was linked to the god Seth, the murderer of Osiris and the embodiment of disorder. Therefore, defeating it was not a sport, it was a sacred duty, a reenactment of the cosmic battle between order and chaos. But the king could not risk an actual hunt where the chaotic beast might win. The priesthood's solution was a carefully staged performance. They would craft a model hippopotamus from ceramic or wood, painting it with fierce eyes and an open mouth. This effigy became the stand-in for all the disorder in the world. During a state festival, the pharaoh, dressed in his ceremonial regalia, would stand before the court. Priests would present him with a ritual harpoon, its shaft inscribed with spells of binding and its point made of bronze or even gold, never meant for real combat. The model hippo might be placed in a shallow pool or simply held aloft by priests. With the eyes of the nobility and the priesthood upon him, the king would then perform the hunt. He would raise the harpoon and cast it, striking the ceramic beast with a resonant crack. The act was precise, rehearsed, and guaranteed to succeed. The priests, serving as both stage directors and sacred technicians, ensured every movement followed a prescribed script. Their incantations filled the air as the harpoon flew, charging the moment with Heka. When the model shattered or was symbolically subdued, the assembly would erupt in celebration. The message was unmistakable. The pharaoh had once again defeated the forces of disorder. He had proven his worth as the living heir of Horus, who avenged his father Osiris by defeating Seth. This ritual was not about the killing of an animal, it was about the perpetual reconfirmation of a cosmic contract. The priesthood, by scripting this drama, reinforced a vital ideological narrative for the entire civilization. They visually demonstrated that the king's primary role was not administrative or even military in the ordinary sense, but cosmological. He was the protector of Maat, the guardian at the gate who kept the hungry chaos of the hippopotamus, of Seth, of famine and invasion at bay. Every successful ritual hunt was a promise to the people. The Nile would flood, the sun would rise, and life would continue in its orderly path because the king, guided by the priests, was doing his job. It turned the abstract concept of cosmic balance into a tangible, thrilling event that anyone could witness and understand. The shattered ceramic pieces were swept away, but the idea they cemented was unbreakable. The safety of Egypt depended on this eternal, ritualized battle, won anew with every throw of the royal harpoon. The shattered hippopotamus symbolized a public victory, but the real war against chaos was often fought in secret with far more personal targets. In the temple's most restricted workshops, priests performed a potent and chilling form of spiritual warfare known as execration rituals. Their weapons were not harpoons, but clay and ink. Their enemies were not animal effigies, but the actual names of those who threatened Egypt's fragile order. A priest would take a plain pottery bowl, or more commonly, a crude figurine shaped like a bound captive, its arms tied behind its back. Onto this surface, he would carefully inscribe a list of names in hieratic script. These were not random individuals. The list could include the reigning kings of rival empires like the Hittites or the Nubians, rebellious chieftains from the desert tribes, or even internal threats, disloyal nobles plotting within the royal court. Sometimes the target was not a person at all, but an abstract concept, famine, plague, or the very word for chaos itself, Isfet. Each name was a focal point for malevolent energy, a spiritual lightning rod that needed to be shattered. The belief behind this was a classic principle of sympathetic magic, the idea that harming an image of something causes harm to the thing itself. By writing a name on the vessel, the priest was capturing that entity's essence, trapping its power in a fragile shell of clay. The ritual that followed was a systematic annihilation. With specific incantations, the priest would first curse the inscribed names, calling upon the gods to revoke their strength and blind their mind. Then he would take the bowl or figurine and violently dash it against a specially prepared stone slab, often one inscribed with images of bound foreigners. The sound of the shattering pottery was the sound of that enemy's power breaking, but the destruction did not stop there. The fragments were then gathered, sometimes burned in a fire to further consume the essence, and finally they were buried in a cursed place. Archaeologists have found these execration deposits buried at the borders of cemeteries, under the foundations of fortresses, or at the gates of temples, places considered liminal zones where the spiritual barrier between worlds was thin. The burial was the final seal, interring the threat in the realm of the dead, preventing its energy from ever returning. This practice reveals the priesthood's role as the unseen guardians of national security. While the pharaoh's armies defended the physical borders, the priests defended the metaphysical ones. They believed a Hittite king could be weakened not just by arrows, but by the ritual breaking of a pot bearing his name in a dark room in Thebes. A famine could be averted by shattering a bowl inscribed with the word for drought. This was proactive spiritual defense, a continuous, secret campaign to identify and neutralize threats before they could manifest in the physical world. It turned the temple into a command center for a war fought with spells and pottery shards, where the ultimate goal was not conquest, but the preservation of a perfect, silent order against the endless, whispering noise of chaos. Fire was not just light and warmth, it was a devouring force that could erase impurity. The ritual of the 4 braziers harnessed this raw, elemental power to build a fortress of sacred space. Before a critical ceremony could begin, before a king was crowned or a temple's inner sanctum was consecrated, priests would perform this precise act of fiery demarcation. They would position 4 metal braziers, essentially ceremonial fire bowls on stands, at the 4 cardinal points around the area to be sanctified. 1 to the north, 1 to the south, 1 to the east, and 1 to the west. Each brazier was then lit, their flames leaping upward in the still air. This was not for illumination, but for creation of a boundary. The 4 fires marked the corners of an invisible, purified square, a zone of absolute safety carved out of a world teeming with invisible threats. Within this square, the most vulnerable of rituals could take place, such as the preparation of the pharaoh for his symbolic rebirth during the said festival, or the final rites for a royal mummy. The fire itself was the active agent. In Egyptian thought, fire was a purifier of unparalleled potency. It could reduce corrupt matter to ash and smoke, sending it upward and away. The heat and light were believed to be inherently hostile to the shadowy, chaotic entities that lurked at the edges of order, the demons and restless spirits who sought to disrupt any sacred work. But the flames alone were just a barrier. The true power came from the words spoken as each fire was kindled. A priest, likely the high priest or a designated ritualist, would stand before each brazier in turn, facing the direction it guarded. As he lit the fuel, he would recite a specific incantation, a command directed at the malevolent forces of that quarter of the world. To the north, he might invoke a spell to repel the cold, sterile winds of death. To the south, his words would target the scorching, fever-bringing spirits of the desert. To the east, he would banish the chaos that preceded the sun's daily rebirth, and to the west, he would block the dangers that followed the sun into the underworld. Each incantation was a verbal key locking that side of the sacred square. The combined effect was a complete 3-dimensional seal. Evil influences from any direction, from the earth below or the sky above, were now walled off by a crackling, spiritual firewall. The space inside became a clean room for the soul, a temporary bubble of perfect maat where the connection between the human and the divine could be established without static or interference. For the person standing at the center, often the pharaoh, the experience would have been intensely sensory. He would feel the warmth radiating from the 4 points, see the flickering light dancing on the faces of the priests, and smell the sharp scent of burning incense mixed with the fuel. He was literally surrounded by protection, enclosed in a box of living flame. This ritual demonstrated the priest's sophisticated command over the natural world as a tool for spiritual engineering. He wasn't just asking the gods for protection, he was building it himself, using fire as his brick and mortar and words as his blueprint. It turned a ceremony's preamble into a feat of sacred architecture, proving that sometimes to create a space holy enough for a god to enter, you first had to burn a barrier into the very air itself. The fire of the braziers secured a sacred space for kings, but a different kind of flame burned in the person of the god's wife of Ammon. This was not a metaphorical title, but one of the most powerful political and spiritual offices ever held by a woman in the ancient world. Imagine a princess, daughter of the reigning pharaoh, leaving the royal palace in the north. Her destination is Thebes, the spiritual capital, home to the immense temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak and its staggeringly wealthy, independent priesthood. Her arrival is a masterstroke of statecraft. She is to be adopted by the serving god's wife and installed in her own lavish residence within the temple precinct. From this moment, her life changes utterly. She takes a vow of celibacy, for she is now the earthly wife of the god Ammon himself. This was a divine marriage in every sense. She was considered the human counterpart to Ammon's divine consort, the goddess Maat. In ritual, she became the vessel through which the god's creative, fertile power could flow into the world, yet she herself remained ritually pure, set apart from mortal men. Her daily duties were a blend of sublime ceremony and hard-nosed administration. In the temple's inner halls, she performed rituals no male priest could. Most famously, she would shake the sacred sistrum, a bronze rattle shaped like the head of the goddess Hathor. Its soft, shimmering sound was believed to be uniquely pleasing to Ammon, a sonic offering that calmed the god's fiery aspects and invited his benevolent presence. She would present lavish offerings and participate in the great festivals, standing as the divine bride beside the statue of her husband, but her power extended far beyond the sanctuary. As the god's wife, she was granted vast estates stretching across Upper Egypt, fertile lands that produced grain, livestock, and wealth. She commanded a full household of stewards, scribes, and servants, effectively running her own independent economic fiefdom within the state. This made her one of the wealthiest individuals in the kingdom, with the resources to commission monuments, fund expeditions, and exert tremendous influence. The genius of this institution was its dual purpose. For the priesthood in Thebes, it created a permanent, high-status link to the royal family. The god's wife was a living, breathing pledge of the pharaoh's commitment to Ammon, a guarantee that the temple's interests would be represented at the highest level. For the pharaoh, especially those from foreign dynasties like the Libyans or Nubians who conquered Egypt, it was the perfect tool for control. By installing his daughter as the god's wife, a foreign king could secure the loyalty of the powerful and often rebellious Theban priesthood without a bloody fight. She was his insider, his agent, a royal seal on the god's own house. Through her, he could influence oracles, steer temple resources, and ensure the god's blessings were seen to flow to his line. The god's wife of Ammon became a cornerstone of stability, a human not tying the royal house to the temple's divine authority, proving that sometimes the most secure bridge between a king and a god was a celibate princess with a rattle in one hand and a ledger in the other. The succession of the god's wife was a matter of national security, a carefully choreographed transfer of divine intimacy and earthly power. When the time came for a new bride of Ammon to be chosen, the reigning god's wife would not bear a natural heir, for her vow of celibacy was absolute. Instead, she performed a ritual of adoption, selecting her successor from among the daughters or sisters of the current pharaoh. This was no simple announcement. It was a multi-day ceremony of immense symbolic weight, designed to publicly and magically transfer the essence of the office. the chosen princess would first undergo rigorous purification rites, bathing in sacred water and being anointed with oils, much like a priest preparing to enter the sanctuary. Then, in the great hall of Karnak temple, before the statues of Ammon and Maat and a gathered assembly of high priests and nobles, the formal adoption would take place. The elder god's wife would present the young woman to the divine statues, speaking prescribed formulas that declared her the chosen vessel, the new beloved of the god. The climax might involve the elder placing her own sacred insignia upon the successor, a heavy gold collar or the ceremonial sistrum rattle, physically passing the tools of office. But the true transfer was believed to be spiritual. Through incantations, the elder's accumulated grace and connection to Ammon were symbolically funneled into her adopted daughter, ensuring the god's favor would not lapse for even a moment. This ritualized adoption solved a profound dynastic problem. It kept the office permanently within the royal family's grasp, generation after generation, regardless of which pharaoh sat on the throne. A king knew his daughter would become the most powerful priestess in the land, and that her immense temple estates and influence would ultimately pass to his granddaughter, not to some unrelated priestly clan. It created a self-perpetuating loop of loyalty. The priesthood in Thebes gained a god's wife who was literally royalty, reinforcing their prestige and connection to the crown. The pharaoh, whether native-born or a foreign conqueror, gained a direct blood-related agent inside Egypt's most powerful and potentially rebellious institution. Her adoption was his insurance policy. The wealth that changed hands was staggering. Formal documents were drawn up by temple scribes, listing the vast holdings of the god's wife, her fields, her herds, her granaries, and her staff. All of this was legally transferred to the new incumbent. She became, overnight, one of the largest landowners and employers in Upper Egypt. This economic clout gave her real, independent authority. She could fund building projects, commission statues, and even deploy her own resources in times of crisis. For centuries, this system of ritual adoption turned the god's wife of Ammon into a living keystone of the state, a human link that prevented the tremendous spiritual and economic power of the Theban priesthood from ever fully breaking away from the crown. It was soft power perfected, where a ceremony of adoption could bind a kingdom together more securely than any army. The precise adoption of the god's wife ensured a dynasty's spiritual lineage, but the entire kingdom depended on a far more fundamental lineage, the unbroken cycle of the seasons. While the nightly star observations guided temple rituals, the priests also managed the calendar that governed every farmer, merchant, and festival in Egypt. This was the civil calendar, a brilliant but imperfect human invention that required constant priestly intervention to keep time from slipping into chaos. The calendar was elegantly simple, 365 days divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days added at the year's end, known as the epagomenal days, celebrated as the birthdays of the gods. But this was roughly a quarter day shorter than the actual solar year. The problem was as practical as it was cosmic. Without correction, the calendar would slowly drift backward through the seasons. A festival meant for planting would eventually fall during the harvest, and a harvest celebration would arrive as seeds were being sown. The entire rhythm of agricultural and religious life would fall into disarray. To prevent this, the priests held the responsibility of inserting an intercalary month, an extra month added periodically to realign the human calendar with the sun's journey. The decision of when to add this month was not taken lightly. It was based on their meticulous observations of the star Sirius and the behavior of the Nile. Their announcement would ripple through the entire country, resetting tax schedules, market days, and the timing of every local festival. They were literally the keepers of time, holding the power to stretch a year when the cosmos demanded it. The most critical observation of all was the heliacal rising of Sirius. After a 70-day period of invisibility, the star would reappear just before dawn in mid-July. This event marked the beginning of the Dog Days, a period of intense heat named for the star's association with the canine goddess Sopdet. More importantly, it heralded the imminent rise of the Nile flood. The priests watching from their temple rooftops would be the first to see that pale glimmer on the eastern horizon. The moment they confirmed it, a system of messengers would activate. Runners and riverboats would carry the news from temple to temple and town to town, a sacred bulletin announcing that the life-giving waters were on their way. This was not just a weather report, it was a divine decree interpreted and delivered by the priesthood. Farmers now knew exactly when to move their animals to higher ground and prepare their irrigation channels. Tax collectors knew when to expect the wealth of the new harvest. The entire bureaucratic and agricultural machine of Egypt lurched into motion based on that single priestly observation. By controlling the calendar and announcing the flood, the priesthood positioned themselves as the essential regulators of reality. They didn't just measure time, they defined its practical meaning for millions of people. A mistake in their calculation could mean failed crops, economic turmoil, and festivals that offended the gods by being held at the wrong moment. Their astronomical skill translated directly into bread on the table and order in the kingdom, proving that their gaze at the stars was, in the end, the most vital earthly responsibility anyone could hold. The rhythm of the calendar was mirrored in the rhythm of sound. While the stars provided a silent, visual clock, the temple's sacred space was also shaped by deliberate, harmonious noise. This was the ritual use of music, an auditory architecture designed to build a bridge the eyes could not see. The air in the temple courts was often filled not with chants alone, but with the layered melodies of harps, the rhythmic plucking of lutes, and the deep, resonant heartbeat of framed drums. These were not background instruments, they were active participants in the ritual, each with a specific spiritual function. The harp, with its curved neck resembling a sailing vessel, was associated with journeys, its soothing tones meant to guide the god's bark or calm a restless spirit. The lute and the lyre provided intricate melodic lines, their strings believed to replicate the harmonious vibrations of the cosmos itself. And the drum, often played by priestesses in ecstatic worship of Hathor, mimicked the primal pulse of life, the very rhythm of the heart and the inundation of the Nile. But among all these, one instrument held a unique and potent role, the sistrum. This was not a typical rattle. It was a ceremonial object of bronze or even precious metal, shaped like a narrow loop or a temple gateway with a handle. Across this frame, loose metal rods were threaded, and on these rods slid small discs of bronze. When shaken by a priestess, often the god's wife of Ammon herself, it produced not a loud crash, but a shimmering, rustling whisper, a sound like wind through papyrus or the gentle hiss of falling water. This delicate noise was its power. It was believed to be the specific sound that pleased and pacified the goddess Hathor, the deity of music, joy, and love. More importantly, the sistrum was a weapon. Its sound was thought to be anathema to chaotic forces. The rustling metal was said to drive away the serpent demon Apophis, who threatened to devour the sun bark each night. By shaking the sistrum, a priestess wasn't just making music. She was actively defending the cosmic order, creating a protective sonic bubble that repelled disorder and invited divine benevolence. The musicians who wielded these instruments were not hired entertainers. They were priests and priestesses who underwent rigorous training. Their mastery was a sacred duty, as precise as any recitation of spells. A wrong note or a broken rhythm was not an artistic flaw. It was a ritual error, a discordant vibration that could irritate a god or weaken a protective charm. Their performances were carefully scored with specific melodies for the awakening of a god, for processions, and for the climax of festivals. When the combined sounds of harp, drum, and sistrum reached their perfect harmony, they aimed to do more than please the ear. They sought to tune the temple's atmosphere to the frequency of maat, to create a resonant chamber where the boundary between the human and the divine grew thin, and a god might choose to step through the veil of sound. This shimmering wall of sound was built from a single, repeated word. The most powerful vocal ritual was not a complex melody, but a focused chant, a mantra repeated until the mind itself began to shift. Priests understood that rhythm and repetition were tools as precise as any surgical instrument, capable of carving a pathway into altered states of consciousness. In the dim light of a side chapel, a group of initiates might sit in a circle, their breathing synchronized. A senior priest would set the pace, intoning a single, powerful name of a god, perhaps the hidden name of Ammon, or a phrase like life, stability, dominion. The others would join, their voices layering over one another, not in harmony but in unison, creating a throbbing, resonant pulse. The goal was to bypass ordinary thought. By fixing their entire awareness on the sound and the rhythm, the repetitive vibration would slowly empty the mind of distraction. The boundaries of the self would begin to feel less solid, merging with the sound wave they were collectively generating. This was not an accidental side effect, it was the intended outcome. In this collective trance state, the priests believed their individual consciousnesses could temporarily fuse, creating a single, more potent vessel for divine energy. It was a spiritual battery being charged through vocal resonance, preparing them to channel power for healing rituals or protective magic. The vibration in their throats and chests was not metaphorical. It was a physical tool reshaping their inner landscape, tuning their group mind to a frequency where the divine could be perceived not as an external statue, but as a palpable force within the shared breath and the endless, echoing name. The shimmering chant faded into a profound silence, and in that quiet, the most important object in Egypt was about to be presented. It was a tiny figure, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, carved from precious faience or even solid gold. This was the goddess Maat, depicted as a woman seated with a single ostrich feather rising from her headdress. To the priest holding her, she was the heaviest object in the world. This was the ritual of offering Maat, the spiritual core around which every other temple practice revolved. After the god's statue had been awakened, purified, dressed, and presented with lavish meals of bread and meat, the high priest or the pharaoh himself would perform this final, essential act. He would raise the small statuette of Maat toward the deity's mouth. This was not another piece of food. This was the sustenance the gods truly craved. Maat represented the perfect, harmonious order of the universe, the principle of truth, justice, and cosmic balance that held chaos at bay. The priest was offering the gods the very reason for their continued engagement with creation. Think of it as a sacred transaction, the ultimate purpose of the entire temple economy. The people gave offerings of grain and goods to the temple. The priests transformed those offerings into divine meals through ritual. And in return, the priest offered the god Maat. He was feeding the deity with the concept of order itself. This simple gesture encapsulated a breathtaking theology. The Egyptians believed the gods did not create the universe out of nothingness and then walk away. They had to actively, continuously maintain it. Their divine energy was the force that kept the sun moving, the Nile flooding, and the seasons turning. But even gods, in this view, needed a reason to expend that energy. They needed to be persuaded that the world was worth upholding. By offering Maat, the priest was demonstrating that Egypt was a land of order, a place where truth and justice prevailed under the pharaoh's rule. He was showing the god that the fundamental contract of creation was being honored on earth. In essence, he was reporting for duty on behalf of all humanity, presenting evidence that the cosmic project was succeeding. A satisfied god would then reciprocate by continuing to uphold Maat in the cosmos, creating a self-reinforcing loop of stability. The entire priestly mission, from the pre-dawn shaving to the nightly star observations, was in service of this single moment. Every ritual purification ensured the priest was a clean vessel to handle Maat. Every correctly recited spell affirmed the truth of her principle. Every aligned temple pillar mirrored the order she represented. If all these preparatory acts were performed flawlessly, then the offering of the small figurine was valid. If any step was flawed, the offering of maat became a lie and the god might reject it. The consequences of that rejection were the ultimate fear. A god deprived of maat might grow weary or angry, allowing its sustaining power to wane. The universe would begin to unravel. The sun might not rise, the river might not flood, and the delicate balance of life would tip back toward Isfet, the formless chaos that existed before time. So that tiny feather on the goddess's head was the fulcrum upon which all of reality balanced. The priest in that silent sanctuary became the linchpin of existence, his steady hand offering not a plea, but a proof that the world he tended was still a place of perfect feather-light harmony. That small feather of maat was a truth written in gold, but the greatest truths were carved in stone. The 24th sacred practice was the mastery of a language not meant for mortal eyes, the intricate and beautiful script of hieroglyphs, literally the sacred carvings. To be literate in this script was to hold a key to the universe, a privilege fiercely guarded by the priesthood and a tiny elite of royal scribes. For the vast majority of Egyptians, the walls of temples and tombs were covered not in mere decoration, but in a glorious, impenetrable mystery. The swirling patterns of birds, snakes, hands, and eyes were the direct speech of the gods, a visual code that only the initiated could decipher. This was not a skill one picked up in a few months. A young boy, often the son of a priest or scribe, would begin his training as early as 5 years old, entering a temple school or a royal administrative academy. His education was a grueling marathon of memorization and precise hand control. For years, he would practice on flakes of limestone or pottery shards, his reed brush dipping into soot and water to form ink. He had to learn over 700 distinct signs, each with multiple potential meanings. A simple drawing of an owl could represent the sound of the letter M, but it could also stand for the actual concept of an owl or be part of a larger, more abstract idea. The student had to master grammar, spelling, and the sacred rules of composition, understanding when to write from right to left, left to right, or top to bottom. It was a lifelong discipline, a mental forge that shaped a small boy into a living library of divine knowledge. But this was far more than an academic exercise. The act of writing hieroglyphs was in itself a magical operation. When a priest scribe dipped his brush to copy a spell from the Book of the Dead onto a papyrus scroll for a wealthy patron, he was not just transcribing words. He was recreating the spell's original power, charging the ink and papyrus with Heka. Every correctly drawn ibis for the god Thoth, every perfectly rendered ankh symbol for life, was a tiny engine of divine energy made permanent. This power was magnified 1,000-fold when transferred to stone. The temple inscriptions we see today, the towering columns covered in meticulously carved reliefs, were not historical records first and foremost. They were permanent rituals. Imagine a master craftsman in the temple workshop, a priest who was also a stonemason. Before his chisel ever touched the limestone, a scribe would have painted the hieroglyphs in red ink. The craftsman would then follow those sacred lines, his mallet and copper chisel releasing a shower of bright dust. With every strike, he was not just carving, he was speaking. The incantation for the king's eternal reign, the hymn to the sun god, the magical protection spell around a doorway, all were being physically embedded into the fabric of the building. Once completed and painted in vibrant colors, these words were alive. They were believed to resonate eternally. Their power activated every time the sun's rays touched them or a priest passed by and read them aloud in his mind. The name of a pharaoh carved deep into a monument guaranteed his memory would last as long as the stone itself, granting him immortality. Conversely, to chisel out a name, to vandalize those holy signs, was the ultimate act of magical destruction, an attempt to murder a soul across centuries. This exclusive command of the god's own language was the ultimate source of the priesthood's authority. They alone could read the divine instructions on the temple walls. They alone could compose the correct spells for the dead, could inscribe the true names on amulets, and could interpret the sacred texts that dictated the rituals of state. It created a wall of mystery as solid as the temple pylons. To the common farmer bringing an offering, the priest was not just a holy man, he was a translator for the very forces that made his crops grow. The intricate beauty of the script was a constant, visible reminder of the vast, unknowable gap between the human and the divine, a gap that only this small, trained group of men could bridge with a reed brush and a steady hand. The lector priest's voice was the only sound in the dark tomb chapel, and the words he spoke were not his own. He was known as the Heb, the carrier of the ritual scroll, and his role was one of absolute precision. During a funeral or a major temple ceremony, he did not improvise or interpret, he performed. In his hands was a papyrus roll, often a specialized ritual manual compiled for that specific occasion. His duty was to recite its contents flawlessly, from the first syllable to the last, without a single hesitation or mispronunciation. The power of the ritual lived entirely in the correct sequence of sounds, and he was the instrument through which that power flowed. A stutter could mean a protective spell failed. A skipped line might leave a soul vulnerable in the underworld. The scroll he held was more than a script, it was a circuit diagram for divine energy, and his voice was the current that brought it to life. To ensure this perfection, his training was relentless. He memorized vast portions of the sacred corpus, but during the actual ceremony, the physical scroll was always present, a sacred safety net and a tangible link to the authority of the written word. His recitation was a performance of perfect recall, a demonstration that the temple's knowledge was not just remembered, but actively, perfectly alive in every moment it was needed. This sacred knowledge was not kept in the priest's head alone. It was stored in the temple's most restricted inner rooms in the House of Life. This was not a library as we imagine it, but a scriptorium, archive, and university combined. Here, teams of priest scribes worked under the Heb's supervision, copying and recopying ancient ritual manuals onto fresh papyrus. These manuals were technical documents. One scroll might detail the exact gestures, incantations, and offerings for the daily awakening of Amun-Ra. Another would be a specialized guide for the said festival, listing every procession route, every costume change for the pharaoh, and every hymn to be sung at each station. Alongside these were astronomical charts tracking the Deccan stars for the night watches, medical texts blending spells with practical remedies for wounds, and detailed topographical lists of the sacred nomes of Egypt for use in rituals of national unity. This written tradition was the backbone of their civilization's continuity. A ritual performed in the reign of Ramesses the Great could be identical to one performed 500 years earlier because the manual had been preserved and copied without error. The House of Life was a sacred hard drive, preserving the operating system of the state across centuries. Controlling this repository was a sacred practice in itself. Access was limited to the highest ranks of the priesthood. A novice could not simply browse the shelves. Knowledge was dispensed on a need-to-know basis, a piece at a time, as a priest advanced in rank and responsibility. This control served multiple purposes. It prevented the dilution or corruption of the rituals by the uninitiated. It protected the politically sensitive information within, like the exact spells for legitimizing a pharaoh, which in the wrong hands could be used to challenge the throne. And it maintained the mystery, the aura of exclusive divine access that was the very source of the priesthood's societal power. When a Heb unrolled his scroll during a ceremony, he was not just reading, he was unveiling a fragment of the god's own blueprint for reality. A secret held in trust for millennia, spoken aloud once more to keep the world from slipping back into silent, formless chaos. The ink on the ritual scroll was dry, the final incantation spoken, but the priest's most challenging duty was yet to come. It was not an act of performance, but of absence. The 25th and final sacred practice was the ritual of withdrawal and seclusion, a deliberate retreat from the very world the priests worked so tirelessly to sustain. This was not a life of permanent monastic isolation. It functioned on a precise, rotating rhythm that made the entire system viable. The priesthood was organized into 4 groups known as files. Each file would serve 1 month of intense, uninterrupted duty within the temple's sacred confines. For that lunar cycle, they lived a life of radical separation. They slept in temple barracks, ate food prepared in the temple kitchens from the god's own offerings, and had no contact with the outside world. They were immersed completely in the cycle of pre-dawn purifications, star observations, ritual feedings, and the charged silence of the sanctuary. Their entire reality was the maintenance of maat, with no distraction from the noisy, chaotic, beautiful mess of ordinary human life. Then, at the month's end, they would undergo a final cleansing rite, step beyond the great pylon gates, and return home. For the next 2 months, they were not priests in the active sense, but farmers, fathers, and landowners. They managed their family estates, tended to their children, and participated in the community. This cyclical design was a stroke of profound social genius. It solved the central tension of their role. How can a man be a pure conduit for the divine, yet remain rooted in the earthly community he serves? Continuous temple service would have made them alien, disconnected from the very people whose fate they influenced. Permanent seclusion would have created a brittle, isolated class that could easily be toppled or resented. But the 1 month in 3 rhythm created a perfect balance. It allowed for deep, immersive spiritual focus, a time to recharge their own sacred status and perform the most critical rituals without the contaminating influence of daily life. The intense seclusion renewed the awe and mystery surrounding their office. When they emerged, they carried the residual sanctity with them, a living blessing moving through the town markets and riverbanks. Yet their regular return to farming and family kept them economically independent and socially integrated. They understood the price of grain, the anxiety of a low flood, the joy of a birth. This made them relatable, trustworthy leaders, not distant mystics in ivory towers. The system also ensured the temple's practical operations never faltered. With 4 rotating shifts, the sacred flame was always tended, the god was always fed, and the cosmic watch was never abandoned. It turned the priesthood from a static institution into a living, breathing cycle, a human reflection of the natural rhythms they observed in the stars and the Nile. The priest planting barley in his field under the sun was the same man who, weeks later, would stand in the dark before Amun-Ra, offering the feather of maat. He served as a constant walking bridge. In his person, he connected the soil to the stars, the harvest to the hymn, proving that the sacred and the secular were not opposing realms, but 2 essential phases in the single, eternal work of keeping the world alive. From the razor's edge at dawn to the silent withdrawal from the world, these 25 sacred practices formed a seamless, self-reinforcing system. The Egyptian priest was not one thing but many, a fusion of roles that would seem impossible today. He was a scientist tracking stars to set the calendar for an empire. He was a politician interpreting divine oracles that could crown a king or start a war. He was a magician wielding words and shattered pottery to fight invisible wars against chaos. He was a farmer overseeing temple estates that fed thousands. He was a chemist brewing sacred incense from secret recipes. He was an architect aligning stone temples with the solstice sun. And above all, he was a spiritual guide shepherding souls through the terror of judgment and into the hope of eternity. Each practice, from the daily shaving to the annual offering of maat, was a single thread in an immense tapestry. Woven together, they created something the ancient Egyptians craved above all else, a stable, predictable world. In a land bounded by harsh desert and dependent on a capricious river, the rituals provided an unshakable rhythm. They promised that if the correct actions were performed with perfect precision, the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and life would continue in its orderly path. The priests were the engineers of this certainty, the human operators of a cosmic machine they believed kept reality itself from unraveling. Their work built a permanent bridge between the chaos of earthly existence and the perfect order of the divine, making the terrifying vastness of the universe feel like a home. It makes you wonder, looking at our own complex world of digital networks, global finance, and invisible infrastructure, how much of our own stability depends on a different kind of unseen ritual and specialized knowledge. Which of these ancient practices, from the sacred shaving to the breaking of the red pots, resonated most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the hidden world of Egypt's spiritual engineers, subscribe for more explorations into history's deepest mysteries.